Welcome back to Ether Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagan and a very special guest. Today we are talking about one of the most long-awaited, anticipated, asked-for topics in the history of really the entire World War Now brand. We're talking about St. John III, Vatatzes, the Emperor of Nicaea. We're going to be talking all about 13th century Greek, Byzantine, Roman history, and all sorts of other things about this wonderful saint and his life. This is going to be a two-parter. So part one is going to be about his life, and part two, we're going to get more into the prophecies. Dimitri, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad, and just happy to be here, for this long-awaited and much cherished episode, I think, going forward. So very happy to be here.
It's really great to have you along for the ride here, and I want to introduce our guest. Without further ado, the wonderful Gregory Heers joins us. You are definitely familiar with some of his work. If you buy products from Uncut Mountain Press, you may recognize his name from somewhere else, though. But Gregory, how are you doing? It's wonderful to have you with us.
Hello, Conrad, Dimitri. It's wonderful to be here. It's a great joy and honor. Christ is risen.
Indeed, he is risen.
Truly, he is risen.
It's a joy to be here. I know we met a couple months ago at the conference we had there in Alabama, the Uncut Mountain Conference. I grew up in Greece. I'm a theology student, and I translate from Greek to English for Uncut Mountain Press, as you mentioned. But in my spare time, I love history, and I especially Roman/Byzantine/Greek history. So yeah, excited to be here.
No, it's great to have you with us. I think you're really probably the best person I could think of to have on the show as far as overlap with worldview and perspective, and you told us you had already been kind of keeping up, so you understand how we like to do things here. So I really think we're about to bring y'all a really exciting, kind of never-before-heard example of a podcast about this specific topic, because I think nobody else is really as prepared right now to discuss this. So without further ado, Gregory, let's just get right into it. Who is St. John Vatatzes? But maybe even before you answer that, what is going on in the Eastern Roman Empire, in the Christian Empire, in the world of Orthodoxy, in the 13th century at the time when this saint, came into being?
Yes, well, St. John, his full name is John III Doukas Vatatzes, and as a saint, he also has the title of the Merciful. He was Emperor of Nicaea, or as the Romans at the time called it, the Emperor of the Eastern Roman lands. But we have to explain, of course, what is the Empire of Nicaea, as we call it today. What happened is that in the 13th century, of course, this is the time of the Crusades. About 100 years earlier, at the very end of the 11th century, is when the First Crusade started. And now we're just over 100 years later, and there have been three Crusades already. The Western Europe is a collection of various states, feudalism. There's the so-called Holy Roman Empire, which is made up of very many little larger and smaller duchies and counties and kingdoms. And there's the Pope. It's after the Great Schism, but it's still only a century and a half after the Great Schism. The lines are still not so clearly defined. You still have. It's at this time that a bishop in Western Greece, Demetrius Komatinos, mentions that there are some Latins who are closer to us in their faith and practices, even though they are presumably by Latins, he means Latin speaking. So it's still, the lines are still somewhat blurry. There's still this ongoing discussions of union occasionally, but the event that is about to happen at the very beginning of the 13th century will have a very big impact on the final separation of the two worlds, Eastern and Western Christendom, and that is the Fourth Crusade. That is a crusade that was originally intended to liberate Jerusalem, just like the other three, but for a variety of motivations and reasons. Venice, the Italian city, is a very major naval power and trading empire. It has its own little trading empire. And the Crusaders asked Venice to give them the ships to go to Jerusalem. And then at this time, the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, which is often called Byzantine Empire, erroneously, I can explain, is actually territorially it's not that badly off. It has essentially most of the southern Balkans, the modern countries of Greece, Albania, and southern Bulgaria, and the western half approximately of Asia Minor. But politically, there's internal turmoil, and a deposed emperor who is seeking to regain his throne goes to the Crusaders and asks their help, promises to give them large sums of money to help them on their crusade if they will restore him to the throne. That was clearly an unworthy emperor there, and the Crusaders agreed to help him. and they go to Constantinople. They are overwhelmed by the sight of the city. They say, one of them writes, "There never was a richer city since the world was made." And they help him regain his throne, and then he is unable and refuses to pay them. And then they riot. Well, they don't riot, but they turn against him. Anyway, to cut a long story short, they take over Constantinople, and they plunder and they loot the greatest city in Christendom. And they say that Geoffrey de Villarduin, in his chronicle of the capture of Constantinople, wrote that the plunder that was taken on that day, or in those days, from Constantinople was more wealth. Since the world was made, more wealth had not been taken from any one city. So this was a major blow on Constantinople, because up to that time, in the 11th century, the empire had suffered a blow from the Seljuk Turks, but in the 12th, under the Komneni, it had recovered, and it was, despite the internal disagreements, it was still a major power. But this blow is a really hard blow, and Constantinople had never been looted, and it had never been plundered in its history. So I think it's hard to understate the richness and greatness of Constantinople. There's a reason why the Vikings and the Scandinavians called it Miklagard, the great city. The Russians, of course, called it Tsargrad, the city of the king, the city of the Caesar, and many other names. It was a city of many names. There were works of art from all over the ancient world. There were ancient statues from Greece and Egypt and Rome. And of course, the libraries there had so many books that most of them have been lost to this day. So much was lost on that day. Most of the Crusaders did not really appreciate the cultural value of what they were plundering and looting. They saw gold, and that's what mattered to them, fortunately. And they captured Constantinople, and they established their own Crusader kingdom, just like they did in the Middle East earlier. There was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now they established the Latin Empire of Constantinople. And it's significant, though, that when they were dividing the Roman Empire, even though they stubbornly refused to call it Roman Empire, they called it the Greek Empire, and the emperor, they called him Emperor of the Greeks. This was a forerunner of the term Byzantine, which was later invented to replace the term Greek in this context. When the treaty that they drew up, the various crusading parties in Venice, called Partitio Romaniae, the partition of Romania, because that was the name of the country in everyday usage, even if in their official documents they refused to call it that. But now that they were in charge of it, now that they were the masters of this country, now they had no scruples in calling it by its real name, Romania, or Romania in Greek. So it's very funny, though, that they decided to divide the empire among themselves because they forgot a key factor, which was the people of the empire, who were not interested in being divided. It actually reminds me a bit of the Scramble for Africa, how there was this meeting I think it was in Belgium, where the key powers decided to divide Africa among themselves. Interesting how history repeats itself in some ways. So one of the crusaders, it might have been Geoffrey of Villarduin again, wrote that the Greeks are revolting everywhere against the Latin rule. And three major centers of resistance were formed very, very soon in the next few years. Because remember, in this day and in that time, events went slower, right? There was no phone, there was no telegraph. So it took, just to get things into perspective, the Crusaders were outside of Constantinople for approximately a whole year. From the time they arrived at Constantinople in 1223, I believe, 1203, until the time when the emperor finally refused to pay them and they turned against him. It was about a whole year of them encamped outside of Constantinople. And then it was another year or two, or even more, over three, before the various successor states, let's say, of Nicaea, Epirus, and the Crusader states of Thessalonica and Athens and Morea were established, because it takes time for letters to travel, it takes time for soldiers to travel. In Constantinople, the Crusaders then marched to Thessalonica, took Thessalonica, they marched on to Athens, and they slowly took over various lands. But three main centers of Roman resistance were Nicaea, right across Constantinople and the shores of Asia Minor, Epirus or Epirus in what is now Western Greece, the Western Balkans. It was also the Empire of Trebizond, but because it was far removed, it was distant, and it also didn't really, besides a few battles early on, the Empire of Trebizond did not press its claim to Constantinople, and it just lived its own life and essentially became irrelevant. So mainly the two main contestants are Nicaea and Epirus. And as I said, they were not called that at the time. They were called the Eastern and Western Roman lands, which also shows that Trebizond was irrelevant, at least in the heartland of Romania. And these two little kingdoms now, these two little empires, had one and the same mission and goal and aim, and that was to reunify Romania, the Roman Empire, the Romans. And of course, the biggest part of that was retaking Constantinople. But it wasn't just retaking Constantinople, it was also liberating the lands that had been captured by the Crusaders, which was the Morea, which is the Peloponnese, southern Greece, Athens, Thessalonica, and Constantinople, of course, and various islands. I'm looking at a map right now, and Epirus is central and western Greece and much of Albania, modern-day Albania. Nicaea is a slice of northwestern Asia Minor. The Crusaders had originally taken the shores of Asia Minor, where Troy is, where Pergamum, where Comedia was, around the Sea of Marmara. But pretty soon, as we'll see, the Empire of Nicaea under St. John took it back. And then we also have, what other players do we have here in this world? We have the Bulgarian Empire, the Second Bulgarian Empire, which saw its chance to regain some lands from the Romans. We have the Turks in Asia Minor, the Sultanate of Rum in the Inner Asia Minor, farther in, Cappadocia and that part. Trebizond, as we said, Trebizond is in what is now northeastern Turkey, Pontus region, close to Georgia. And that was one of the last places to fall to the Turks, by the way. It survived for 80 years after the fall of Constantinople, in the 15th century. And then in southeastern Asia Minor, around Tarsus, St. Paul's birthplace, we have Cilician Armenia, but that's not relevant to our story today. And most of the Aegean is under Crusader control. And there's also the Venetians, the Venetians, who are not Crusaders, but they have many islands because they're traders and they care about the trade routes, and they have their own trading empire. So it's in this world, in this fractured world. It's very fascinating because we see history replaying itself, just like in the 5th century in the West, back when the Roman Empire stretched from Great Britain to the Nile. You had Germanic barbarian tribes enter in and take many lands and the old capital of Rome, and eventually establish all these little feudal kingdoms in the West. And you have the Roman Empire trying to reclaim its territories, for example, under Justinian. Now we have something very similar. Or you could say, even later, a second replay was right before the Fourth Crusade. You had Roman Empire in the East and a collection of kingdoms and duchies in the West. And now we have the Nicaean Empire in the east of this Aegean world, and a collection of crusading kingdoms and other kingdoms to the west of it. Because it's not the Crusaders, it's not just the Crusaders, it's also the Bulgars, the Serbs, and the Crusaders, but also are not unified. As I said, there's one king in Constantinople, Baldwin the First, I believe, was the first. There's another ruler in Thessalonica. There's the Duchy of Athens. There's the Duchy of Achaea, which is Morea. So this is the situation now, post 1204, post Fourth Crusade in southern Balkans, in Asia Minor, the Aegean world, let's say. It's a fractured world, and many players contesting for domination, and really Constantinople, because the Bulgarians also want to take Constantinople. Epirus and Nicaea both want Constantinople, and of course the Crusaders want to keep, and the Pope wants to keep Constantinople.
And into this sort of complicated and entangled, and of course, in terms of policy, geopolitics, and foreign relations, this sort of really complicated world, John III begins his reign. He doesn't essentially start his reign amongst a sort of time of peace when things are clearly outlined, as you've stated, Gregory, where it's very clear who your enemies and who your allies are. In this particular world, there are the kingdoms of Bulgaria. Naturally, you mentioned even the Bulgarians considered themselves an empire. You have the Seljuk Turks to your east. So it's not just the filioque wielding heretical Catholics who are your enemies here, or even potential enemies, because St. John III did at times want to seek sort of peaceful compromise with them in terms of like the political borders and whatnot. There are also these weird pagans as well as Muslims, and you're essentially surrounded by just this aura of essentially it does feel like the time of revelations and sort of the end of the world, essentially, because, and even I think the local people of the empire understood that as well. The Romans of the times, the historians do mention that coincidentally the that small sliver of land, which we call the Empire of Nicaea, at least in the history books, but which is the last sort of remnant of the Roman Empire outside of Constantinople. Coincidentally, it did have the 7 cities which are mentioned in the book of Revelation. So Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, which you see in the first chapter of Revelation. So of course the local Orthodox Christians reading the book of Revelation are essentially looking at themselves and saying, here we are in the empire in exile. We still have an Orthodox patriarch of Constantinople and Nicaea. We still have an emperor, but the Antichrist will probably be here any minute now, especially since our capital has been taken. And of course you have the Seljuk Turks of Rome just to your east. Of course, the ever-present Islamic pressure is on you. And St. John's reign essentially begins in that year of 1221. His really long, almost over 3-decade-long reign commences after the 16-year reign of his father-in-law. And that's essentially how St. John becomes the emperor in the first place. So succession in the Byzantine Empire wasn't always the most straightforward thing. In the Roman Empire, that is, as you probably know from the times of Caesar and Augustus, it wasn't, unfortunately, there was never really an established pattern, except for, of course, passing down rulership through your children, adopted children, or even children-in-law. So this is how John III actually received the crown. It's because he married the daughter of the previous emperor, Theodore Lascaris. And Theodore I was a very successful emperor. He was the first emperor in exile, you can say. He reigned for 16 years, and he actually, we could probably do an entire episode on him alone, but he was essentially this major political player, a very skilled, tactful diplomat, as well as even military leader. He was by profession a general, similar to John III, but as we'll discuss, John III was slightly even more than that. But Theodore I really set up this Empire of Nicaea, this Roman Empire, for a comeback, and John III continued his work on throughout his reign. But what's interesting is, yes, so St. John married the daughter of Theodore Lascaris, and naturally, at the beginning of his reign, there was this commotion. Well, say you marry the daughter of the emperor, and thus you become the emperor yourself. He was anointed. He had his coronation ceremony. The patriarch, I believe it was Patriarch Germanos II, anointed and crowned him during a service in the city of Nicaea, and he should have been an established leader of the empire at this point, and he should have led straight away from there. But unfortunately, as there always are in history, there are traitors, even amongst, so-called Orthodox Christians. And the 2 brothers, actually, of the previous emperor collaborated with the Catholics, with the people who actually took power in the Latin Empire of Constantinople, and they collaborated and conspired to bring in a Catholic Crusader army onto the Empire of Nicaean territory. So they brought an army over the Hellespont, over the territories of Gallipoli, where Alexander the Great once crossed, in 330 BC to fight the Persian Empire. They crossed in that same area using Venetian boats, which is interesting, Gregory. Again, the Venetians you always have to pay the Venetians up front. They'll cross your army over a certain river, massive sea of water, and of course they get the pay, but they also witness your bloodshed. And essentially, very similar tactics we see people, like Lockheed Martin investing in the destruction of others, basically, and investing in warfare. So the Venetians accommodated this transfer of a massive Crusader army, several thousand knights, which is significant if you know anything about medieval warfare. It's several thousand knights may not sound like a lot, but this essentially it's equivalent to an entire World War II army of tanks. These are people wearing very heavy armor. Their horses are trained not to fear anything. They will charge into the enemy's ranks, disrupting tens, if not hundreds of units, infantry at once. It's a powerful tool of war, which was used by the Crusaders very, very strongly in the Battle of Ashkelon during the First Crusade, and by King Richard the Lionheart, who unfortunately passed away before the siege of Constantinople. He passed away in the year 1199. So Richard the Lionheart used the same Crusader charge tactic at the Battle of Arsuf, and this tactic was actually called it was given a particular name by the Russians, the Svinfil and this translates to boar snout tactic. Essentially, it's like an arrowhead tactic where the Crusaders line up in essentially like a spear tip arrowhead, which is a little bit broader, and they charge into battle. And so John III, he's only 32 years of age. He hasn't had any military experience. I mean, he was probably trained on how to ride horses using spears, bows, fight with swords, things like that. But in terms of being a tactician, we have no recorded history of him actually participating in any battles. In fact, he was a well-known administrator, and his role in the court of his father-in-law was, in fact, that of, I would say, the chief bodyguard general. So he was in charge of courtly city affairs, but in fact, he wasn't really participating in overseas campaigns or anything of that sort. And yet, this 32-year-old emperor, just like the Roman emperors of old, would need to participate in the battle against these crusaders himself. And of course, the empire never witnessed such a large crusader army on its territory prior, at least not this Nicaean land. And so at the Battle of Paimaninon, the 32-year-old emperor faces the cavalry of the Crusaders. He allows them to actually intercept into his infantry rank. And from what we understand in this battle, he had his own heavy cavalry of, I would only guess, would be a heavy cavalry of the Byzantines, a similar, maybe the last remnant of cataphracti, which we see in history. And he used that particular regiment to counterattack the boar snout charge of the Crusaders, and destroyed their heavy cavalry right there, disrupted them. And the Crusaders were very shocked by this, including, of course, the traitorous his Byzantine uncles, who also contributed to this particular incursion. And the Crusader army was routed. And this particular victory, right at the beginning of his reign, kind of marked the future successes, because as we see through the reign of John III and him being a saint, it's almost as if through his prayer life, he managed to accommodate all these various worldly, geopolitical, diplomatic, and even economic, right, agricultural, empire-building successes. It's a very interesting combination of personal as well as spiritual qualities, which led to the success of this particular country, which by Lord's providence he was given governorship over. It's not an accident that he married in the sacrament of marriage in the church the daughter of the Emperor Irene. We don't see these things as accidents. Some people are meant to be together in unity and in marriage. And of course, the sacraments of the church were seen as these key moments in a person's life. So of course, the anointing of the emperor, the marriage to Irene, these were seen as legitimizing John III. And especially after this battle, he was definitely considered a legitimate emperor by everybody in the courts. Of course, there were always conspirators, and St. John III dealt with them accordingly. And in fact, one of the reasons, Gregory, I think why people call him merciful is because despite all of the conspiracies against him inside the courts at Nicaea, by the Crusaders, working with all these various merchant classes, and of course there's always Genoese and Venetian money, of course, probably circulating around, bribes being taken. Despite all of this, he doesn't do like a Stalinist 1937 purge of his conspiracies. He doesn't have any mass executions. In fact, the worst that he does to people is probably, as per the Byzantine Roman imperial custom, they would be sent to a monastery, into exile, essentially into prison, long-term, detainment where they could focus on their prayer life rather than cause disruption and suffering to other people. So this was actually quite merciful for the time, I would say. And even by today's standards, where political opponents are assassinated left and right and terrorist acts are committed essentially against various interest groups and politics. So John III really is an example even to us today in terms of how to conduct geopolitics very bravely, himself being involved in the cavalry charge with a spear. I mean, that really says a lot about him, but also diplomatically speaking. His reign begins with success and it ends with a success, in a spiritual sense as well. So I think that's really kind of paints a really nice portrait of this character, and even perhaps you can say, spiritually speaking, his icon, because Saint John III is canonized in the Orthodox Church. And I think once we begin discussing the rest of his life, you can kind of see why. It's just a consistent Orthodox way of doing politics, a consistent ruler who reaches success and really doesn't compromise with the faith, which is, I think, a key moment, especially in this time. You mentioned, Gregory, 150 years after the Great Schism, 170 years, you have the Crusaders spreading filioque all over Thrace and occupied Greece and the Peloponnese, and of course the city of Constantinople as well, as relics are being taken out of the cities and already sold to various Western countries. And there's a lot of disruption happening. And the heresy of the filioque, as well as various other local heresies, are probably spreading all over the once Orthodox land. And suddenly God grants the Romans this figurehead, this personification, essentially, this Christ-like icon of a leader, of a strong Old Testament type king. And in fact, they actually associated John III, at least the historians at the time, they associated him with Joshua from the Old Testament. His father-in-law was associated with Moses because he kind of brought them into Exodus. They saved the remnant of the empire. But John III was associated with this figure of Joshua, who would bring the Romans back, the Orthodox back into their lands and save them all, not just from heresy, but also from extinction.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And Theodore Lascaris, as you said, he played a major role in establishing the Empire of Nicaea and in establishing this resistance. And his son-in-law was a very worthy successor, St. John, who led the charge back, retake Constantinople, retake the lands they had lost. And in the writers of this time, we see very much the themes of exile. They compare themselves to the Babylonian captivity, the destruction of the temple, and they consciously try to remodel Nicaea in the image of Constantinople. St. John, later in his reign, he even built a second wall and a moat around Nicaea in order to make it look like, the triple wall of Constantinople. What you mentioned earlier about his mercifulness is very significant. I think the most severe punishment that he gave to traitors was the standard Christian Roman punishment of blinding, which was what capital punishment was replaced with. People today don't really seem to understand that. Most people today think that blinding is something very cruel and it's much more merciful to kill someone, but that's not at all an Orthodox view, because if you kill someone, there's no possibility for repentance. Whereas blinding, you stop him from continuing his evil doing, and you give him a chance to repent by, as you said, by going to a monastery or a quiet place. And even the blinding was more of an exception than the rule. Other times, the conspirators, he simply imprisoned them or exiled them. But even more than that, even more than his merciful treatment of his enemies, is his love for his people, especially the poor people, the everyday man, the farmer. And his policy was distinctly favorable to the lower classes as opposed to the aristocrats. He even took away some of the lands from aristocrats who had many lands and redistributed them, or from aristocrats who were absent. Some who before the Fourth Crusade they had owned lands in Asia Minor, but now they weren't here. They had fled elsewhere. So he confiscated those lands and he redistributed them to soldiers, to farmers, and he did very much to strengthen the lower classes, to strengthen the local economy, and to stop the competition from foreign traders and from foreign imports.
Yeah, we see St. John really create this sort of autarkic model state in exile. They recognized that they weren't living in the ideal empire with the capital in Constantinople, but they, at its peak, really made the total best of what they could. And we see, I think, an example of what we can see now when, Constantinople is currently still occupied by the Turks. And even in America, we are in a secular country, all of these sorts of things. I think this gives us a model for how someone can still make an Orthodox society, whether it's within a state or whether it's a smaller version of a state, like in the case of Greece or like in America, how we can live in an Orthodox way despite the fact that we are effectively living under an occupied spiritual rulership that is not Orthodox, that is not part of the Christian empire. But Dimitri, you mentioned a lot of things about how at the time the people would be thinking of themselves as living in the last days. And I think part of the reason why this is such a relevant subject to us on World War Now, of course, we love and venerate St. John Vatatzes, and we talk a lot about the prophecies. We're going to talk about more about that in part 2, but is also because of how the political situation is also being mirrored to the point where we think that if and when, St. John does come back and return as the sleeping king and rule from Constantinople, we see that this same time period would line up with our own eschatology in the sense that Constantinople was restored after the Empire of Nicaea, after St. John's reign had really brought it to this zenith. Constantinople was able to be retaken, and for 200 years they were able to kind of restore the empire before it fell for good in 1453, which is curiously almost 1,000 years directly after, the Christianization of the entire empire under St. Constantine and St. Theodosius. But now, of course, we hear about this restoration and perhaps a brief interregnum and spreading of orthodoxy before the Antichrist. These are the kind of reasons why we can then look into the details of how St. John ruled the empire and perhaps apply them to today. Of course, it's said that he banned usury in the empire, which of course would go a long way towards appealing to the lower classes, towards perhaps representing the poor, as well as, of course, the aristocracy. And of course, we also know about his personal holiness would have guided him towards that as well. He was a prayerful person. We're going to talk about his incorrupt relics in a little bit, near closer to the end of the show when we talk about his repose. But he was able to resist, Genoese, Venetian, trade influence, and usury, which we can then extrapolate to mean he was, resisting Jewish influence in the region and everything. So I think we can see that he was using the power that God had given him correctly, and it undoubtedly points to him and the Empire of Nicaea as the correct successor state to the Roman Empire. Of course, Gregory made some good points in that regard, of Trebizond being less relevant and Epirus eventually falling away, and of course everybody knowing due to heresy that the Latin Empire is non-viable to begin with. But at the same time, everybody at the era is trying to claim to be Rome. Even the Muslims or the Sultanate of Rum, everyone's trying to claim the identity of the Roman successor state, which is still relevant to this very day as we talk about Moscow and Russia, being the third Rome in the face of things. There are many ways that this exact same conversation and the idea of a Roman interregnum, or the twilight of the empire, is still very much relevant today. We talk all about how in many ways we believe the end of this age began with the martyrdom of the Romanovs and the true snuffing out of the final Christian emperor, to the point where we are now living in this chaotic time, almost like the time of Judges in the scriptures. So I know I'm kind of rambling here, but Gregory, before we maybe start talking about, the end of his life and some of his legacy, I want to get some of your thoughts on the major points of his reign. Of course, we know he was close with Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. We know that he brought the emperor great, just basic territorial gains, as well as was a fantastic patron of the arts and sciences, and his relatives, both his his children had many contributions to the church, as well as he had two wives, and both of them are also very relevant to the story. So I'm wondering if you could fill in some of these details for us.
Yes, of course. So first of all, I wanted to read a quote from an historian called Nikiforos Grigoras, which I think sums up his reign very well. Nikiforos Grigoras starts by comparing Theodore Lascaris with his son-in-law St. John, and says that while Theodore Lascaris was more impetuous and active and, you could say, had more of impetus and force, St. John was more measured and balanced and helped both της Ρωμαίων πράγμαση και στρατεύμαση, both Roman affairs and army. And then he concludes by saying that St. John did everything with measure and with regulation and in its own time. But then the historian concludes by saying that each emperor was in his proper time, that the early days post Fourth Crusade needed an emperor that was very, for lack of a better word, impetuous, like Theodore, to stop the flow of the Crusaders and to set up a Nicaean kingdom, while the years after Theodore needed an emperor with very much wisdom and discretion, a balanced and measured emperor who wouldn't just rush into every battle, but would try to reserve his strength and try to maximize his gains while minimizing his expenses and his losses, which is what St. John was. And significantly, the historian mentions that St. John didn't just focus on wars, on reconquests, but also on the word he uses is pragmacy, which is affairs or business, or actually it's often a translation of the Roman word res publica, the common affairs, which points to the fact that St. John didn't, you can see there are two sides to his reign. There's the military side, and he did get a lot back for the Empire of Nicaea. All the Asia Minor lands, almost all the Asia Minor lands. He took back Thrace, eventually Thessalonica. He almost more than doubled his domains. But it wasn't just about reconquest, because if you reconquer without consolidating, if you reconquer without, actually I should say liberate, it wasn't conquest, it was liberation of his fellow countrymen. But if you do that without focusing on your home front, on your behind the lines, then you're setting up yourself for collapse. You're setting up yourself for having a large kingdom that's weak inside. And so, on the other hand, what did he do? He strengthened the local production, as I said. He encouraged farming. He encouraged viniculture. He encouraged animal husbandry, having fowl, poultry. He encouraged, in fact, textile production. The city of Nicaea used to be a major center of textile production. But in his day, this was rivaled by foreign imports. So he banned any sort of importation of textiles and made a law that all his subjects must dress and clothe themselves by native homespun fabric made in Nicaea, quote unquote. And then he was also very fair, as I mentioned earlier, towards the lower classes. Even in the army, he didn't just fill the army with mercenaries. He was, in fact, very, very reticent to use mercenaries. And the ones he did use, the Pechenegs or Cumans, he didn't go looking for them. They came to him. They came to him asking for asylum. He agreed to take them in and give them lands to cultivate and positions in the army to fight. Now one son Theodore, who succeeded him after 1254, was very literate, was very well educated, classical education, and very, very pious. But he was not as great a man as his father was, which is very difficult. Very difficult to top that. But very significantly, Theodore wrote, St. John's son, not his father-in-law, wrote several theological treatises, and especially he wrote the great supplicatory canon to the Mother of God, which, at least in the Greek Orthodox world, we chant every other day during the Domitian fast, and it's a personal favorite of mine. And when I learned that it was written by Theodore Lascaris II, and a little bit about his life, he had a very hard life. As emperor of Nicaea, his father left him with a much larger kingdom, much larger empire, and it was a very hard time. Enemies on all sides, and he had his own health problems, health issues. Theodore did, and if you look closely at the hymns that he wrote in the Great Supplicatory Canon, you will see that he mentions that very often. He says, now I'm freely translating from the Greek in my mind, the turbulences of life, the troubles of life have surrounded me like bees around a honeycomb. Or he mentions the arrows of the enemies, the spiritual enemies, and calls on the Mother of God. So if you know that history and who wrote this canon, for me it really adds depth to that. And as you mentioned, Dimitri or was it Conrad? John was also allied with Emperor Frederick of Germany, of the so-called Holy Roman Empire. And after the death of his first wife, Irene Lascarina, he married the daughter of Frederick, whose original name was Constance, but she was renamed Anna when she came into the Nicene court, which seemed a little strange to me because Constance in Greek would be Constantia. It sounds like a very Roman name, Constantine, Constantia. But for some reason, they wanted to call her Anna. And I think, personally, I find it very fascinating that he was allied with the Holy Roman Emperor, which at first glance might seem a little counterintuitive, given the history of these two empires, how they were rivals for most of their history. But in this case, the Pope was a greater threat because he was backing the Crusader kingdom of Constantinople. So to ally himself with Germans would counterbalance the Pope's alliance with the Crusaders. It's interesting also. I'm not sure what the implications would be in the ecclesiastical sphere. Does that mean that if the church in Germany was not quite following the Pope, were they? Or was the political antagonism also ecclesiastical? Does that imply that there was some? Because I know that even 2 centuries later, at the time of the Council of Florence, there was a rival council in I forget the city, but there was a council of German bishops against the Pope. They wanted more conciliarity. So I think that would be interesting to look at in terms of ecclesiastical history, and exactly in terms of the Great Schism. We know that it's not black and white, right? But how does that play out? Does this alliance with Frederick imply that maybe the church in Germany is not quite papal as much? I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's actually that period of time, so the 13th century, when obviously the Filioque is already settling down in Germanic lands, Frankish lands, and yes, sure, perhaps the theology of the German states wasn't as fine-tuned, and we can see that later in the development of Protestantism, which is incredibly primitive in terms of its essential theological outlook 300 years later. But the Germans could, I think, feel, and the Franks, they could feel this weird, the heresy, the reality of heresy kind of seeping in, and especially they could feel it in a worldly sense in the fact that the Pope had this essentially Emperor Palpatine type power in a weird way, this supreme ruler over all kings. This concept was very strange, I think, to the Frankish kings, who essentially gave the Pope that power in the first place by allowing him to crown Charlemagne, Pepin I, and all these other Frankish rulers. But also Friedrich II, I think, he saw himself as the Emperor of the West. He also understood that, hold on, there's a real concern here for the Pope, the Patriarch of the West, having the supreme power over kings. And this is a completely different outlook on, how royal power interacts with that of the patriarchs or that of the high clergy, especially in the Orthodox Church. We know that because we sustain an uncorrupted model. The patriarchs, Germanos II, Methodius II, Manuel II, all three patriarchs who lived during the reign of John III, never sought to usurp sort of earthly power away from, St. John III, who was the emperor. There was a clear division, a clear symphonia going back to St. Justinian the Great. In the West, unfortunately, they've lost that. And they lost that very early on in the 800s under Charlemagne. And as strange as that is, because Charlemagne is painted as this really powerful type figure, but he is actually the one, and his dynasty, in particular the Carolingians, who actually gave that up. And Friedrich II was almost the last attempt, the last hurrah of Western and Central European monarchies to take back power into where it should be, which is in the hands of essentially secular laity. And so you have Friedrich II, of course, leading this resistance, which is, it can be called like the civil war of Guelphs and Ghibellines. It's worth reading about. It's a very particular Roman Catholic internal dispute, I would say, between, of course, the Guelphs, who were essentially, they fought of papal power as superseding the power of earthly kings and emperors, and the Ghibellines, who are more of the idea that, well, the emperor's power was either greater than that of a local patriarch such as the Pope, or at least equal to, in terms of like sort of more symphonia. It was the vision of, say, Frederick II in that case was very, very orthodox. And I think John III probably saw that too, essentially considering his letter to the popes, which could be seen as incredibly disrespectful these days, but he never saw the Pope as, you know, a sort of patriarch above himself, which is something completely foreign and very heretical, almost as heretical as the filioque itself. And so we do see this particular disconnection. That's how I see Frederick II's relationship with John III. Frederick II really understood that this was not traditional in any Christian sense. This was very foreign, and I think he also fought for that independence. Naturally, you know, the marriage of Friedrich II's daughter, she was quite young at the time too, John III, who was already a little bit older, was, I think, purely political, especially considering how John III really loved his first wife, who passed away, I think, before her time, Irene, unfortunately. But that is part of the consideration in those days. Diplomacy was such a delicate matter, and we see this, I think, in the event none other than, say, the Mongol conquest, right? Which is, I think, one of the key events. I mean, there's so many important things that take place in the 13th century during the John III's reign, which essentially require his reaction. He can't simply sit and passively watch things take place. He needs to somehow address these challenges, just like in the modern world. You know, you have Orthodox or nominally Orthodox rulers, you know, in Serbia, Russia, Georgia, Orthodox countries around the world, for example, like President Putin. They need to react to worldly events taking place and changes in economics, changes in geopolitical outlines. And you simply, once you're given rulership over a certain people, it is your duty before God to actually rule them wisely and appropriately as a Christian. So John III had to react to the Mongol conquest, which, as we know from the Battle of the Sit River and the Battle of the Khalkha, which took place in the north in Russia when the Mongols began invading an Orthodox country under John III's patriarch, right? Keep in mind. So this is the Russian Church is a part of the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople, still a member of the Greek Church. And suddenly these northern lands begin, you know, they just get ravaged by this Mongol onslaught in 1237 and 1238, all the way until 1240, and which sort of marks the beginning of the Mongol yoke. The great Orthodox cities of Ryazan, Kiev, Chernigov, and Vladimir, especially the old capital, were completely destroyed. And even the young settlement of Moscow, which was only established, less than 100 years before that, and it was essentially a fortress amongst the woods and rivers in central Russia, is completely destroyed and burned down by the Mongols. So the Mongols created this massive need for reaction. And of course, they then sacked and affected all these Western countries as well, many of which were literally right on the border of St. John's territory, such as the Bulgarian Empire, the Hungarian Kingdom, and even the Latin Empire. The Catholics prepared for the Mongols to invade them as well, which didn't take place, but then again, the Latin Empire was very small at that time, so perhaps the Mongols simply didn't have the time. And also, Mongols were very superstitious about crossing large bodies of water. So it's in a true geopolitical Eurasianist sense, they were a very land empire. You know, they did try to invade Japan slightly, but didn't really work out. They weren't very seafaring people like the Venetians and Genoese, Italians. But what we do see is this interaction between the Mongols and John III. And you may think, well, how did he react? Did he, like Alexander Nevsky, did he swear fealty? Did he pay them taxes? Did he travel to Karakorum, the capital of the Mongol Empire in literally Mongolia, so all the way near China? In fact, John III did send envoys and ambassadors. One Western historian records that there were Byzantine, Roman ambassadors and envoys in the court of the Mongol Khan during the reign of John III. They were wearing official uniforms, armor, dressed in the official garbs of the court of Nicaea, but they did not swear fealty and they did not pay the Mongol Khan any taxes. Which, if anyone knows Mongolian sort of Tatar history, this is significant because in the Mongol vision of the world, in their sort of pagan outlook, spiritually and geopolitically, it's a binary choice. You either swear fealty and you pay taxes, even just a portion or sort of nominal amount, or you're an enemy of the Mongol Empire and you need to be put down. But St. John III did neither of these things. And it's almost as if, in an Old Testament type sense, God will turn your enemies sort of in your favor in a way. You have this massive empire which essentially attacks all the enemies of Orthodox countries, of course, included, unfortunately. But so essentially the Mongol Empire attacks the Seljuk Turks, who were just the enemies of St. John III to the east, completely disrupts this Islamic Turkish formation. They disrupt the activities of the Muslim oppressive caliphate in the East completely. And they allow the Romans to relax a little bit after these, essentially 600 years of battling the Islamic Caliphate. So finally the Romans have some breathing room, and they can finally relax thanks to the Mongols. But also the Bulgarians, who are very unpredictable at this time, they're sort of flirting with Catholicism, despite the fact that they are, I guess, across the board Orthodox people. But they're very unpredictable type people, and the Mongols unfortunately ravaged the Bulgarian lands as well as the lands of the Hungarian kingdoms and things like that. So the Mongols, the only empire of the time and of the land in the Middle East, and you can say Europe, which they really don't invade, which by all accounts they really should have, geopolitically speaking, was the empire of John III. And that's, I think, not a coincidence. I think it's one of the spiritual fruits of actually being a leader who is well in tune with his Orthodox faith. And so in a way, you can almost pray the enemy away. You can pray protection for your empire. And I think that's very obvious for anyone sort of studying sort of modern and later history later on, is that of course the spiritual state of the empire, of geopolitics, of even diplomacy, really greatly depends upon who exactly rules it and how Christian of a ruler you have at the head of your state. We see this in Russia with Alexander Nevsky, who is a contemporary of John III. He of course ruled exactly at the same time, probably maybe even had correspondence with John III, being sort of his Roman Empire ruling from Nicaea and Nymphaeon in the south. But
thank you so much for listening to this free preview of Ether Hour, everybody. That's a pretty good free segment, a long segment for you. St. John Vatatzes, what an amazing saint. We want to really thank Gregory for coming on and giving us this insanely in-depth look into his life and his reign as the Emperor of Nicaea, and we want everybody to get behind the paywall, listen to the full analysis. We talk about all sorts of stuff, and look forward to the future episode where we're going to talk about the prophecies, the Marble King, the Sleeping King, our analysis on all of that and how it ties into current events. Gregory will be coming back, so get behind the paywall, show us the support, let us know how much you loved this episode, and thank you again so much for listening. God bless. Christos Danesti.